The 1960s is often romanticised these days with the whole swinging 60s scene in London, but in reality for the most part, Britain was still a gloomy post-war place in the 60s. Many people suffered with depression and desolation, and loneliness was also common. Now most pop groups of the day wrote boy-girl love songs that offered a form of escapism from this gloomy reality. But in 1966, the biggest band of the lot decided to abandon that and lean into the themes of loneliness and depression, and take a look at the neglected concerns and fates of the elderly, a theme that the Beatles would go all the way to #1 in the pop charts with. Welcome back to Revolver In-Depth, and this is episode 2, Eleanor Rigby. So one day in the mid-1960s at Jane Asher's family home in Wimpole Street in London, Paul McCartney was sat at his piano in his music room down in the basement of the family home. Here he was vamping an E minor chord whilst trying to write a melody on top of it. Now at this point Paul didn't have any lyrics for the song, it was just an instrumental. He was just making sounds and saying random words, stuff like ba 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 when he was sort of playing it. Anyway, one day he then decided he would then head over to Maida Vale to visit his friend and fellow musician Donovan, where he would present this song to him for the first time. According to Donovan, at this point the song was about a strange chap called Eleanor Rigby, and it was more of a drug song with lyrics that went like this: Eleanor Rigby, blowing his mind in the dark with a pipe full of clay. No one can say. Do excuse my terrible singing there. But basically at this point McCartney, he wasn't happy with the lyrics, but he did really like the tune. He felt he had something there with the tune itself. It just needed a new set of lyrics basically. So once he was back in his music room at Wimpole Street, Paul would eventually have a breakthrough. He'd have a eureka moment. This idea came to him of a wedding. Basically there would be this wedding and there'd be a person who would pick up the rice in the church where the wedding has been. Now Paul liked this idea of a person staying behind to pick the rice up, because to him that suggested loneliness, and that gave him a theme for the song. He would explore the idea of loneliness and this lonely character. So for a little while, Paul now had a character called Miss Daisy Hawkins. The tune would have gone, Miss Daisy Hawkins picks up the rice, etc, etc. But he didn't like this name. He felt it wasn't a very realistic name, so he would then go in search of a better name. So in searching for this name, Paul would draw inspiration from two different places. Firstly, a shop in Bristol called Rigby and Evans Limited. Now, when Paul was down in Bristol visiting Jane Asher at the time, she was acting in a play at the Old Vic Theatre in Bristol. He'd seen this shop and he liked the name Rigby, so he kept that as the surname. And the Eleanor portion, the second inspiration, well, that came from the actress Eleanor Bron, who had starred alongside the Beatles in their 1965 film Help. She's the lead female character now. But that's where the Eleanor portion comes from. As a side note, she was rumoured to also have an affair with John Lennon, but that's a story for another day. So yeah, the character now had the name Eleanor Rigby. Now we're just going to diverge a little bit here from the main story and go down a little bit of a rabbit hole about a certain gravestone in Liverpool. So at Walton Cemetery, beside St Peter's Church in Liverpool, there is a gravestone for someone called Eleanor Rigby, who was born in 1895 and died in 1939. The reason I mention this is St Peter's Church is where McCartney first met Lennon on July 6, 1957, and McCartney has spoken about how as a child he used to walk through the graveyard. Now there are some people out there who believe that this gravestone is the Eleanor Rigby in the song. It's what's inspired it, it's where Paul got the inspiration from, because they think it's too big of a coincidence that this gravestone is pretty much beside where John and Paul met, and Paul used to walk through here as a kid. However, Paul just flatly refuses this. He says that it's just a pure coincidence, it has nothing to do with the song. It came from a shop in Bristol and an actress. It's not this gravestone. I've been on a taxi tour actually around Liverpool many years ago, and the tour guide said on that tour that Eleanor Rigby was inspired by this gravestone. I didn't know well enough at that time, but now I just said no, it wasn't. And got into probably an argument with him because that's a lie. It is a lie. That the song was not inspired by that gravestone. But regardless, it is a weird coincidence that where John and Paul met, there is a gravestone that says Eleanor Rigby. So let's get back to the main story here. The Beatles would eventually gather along with Lennon's childhood friend Pete Shotton in John's music room in his house in Kenwood. And while they were there, Paul would debut Eleanor Rigby to them for the first time. Now at this point, Paul only had the tune, the actual music, and the first verse. He had nothing else. So the reason he was presenting it to them was he wanted them to chip in to try and help him finish this song off. Which means Eleanor Rigby is one of the very few Beatles songs where all four of them have actually contributed to the lyrics. Although only John and Paul get credit, it's a Lennon and McCartney song, it's the way it is. So Harrison's contribution to the lyrics would be writing the look at all the lonely people part, and then after that bit was written, the group would then decide to implement a second character into the song, a character who was called Father McCartney. Now he would serve as a lonely priest. So next up, Ringo would contribute some lyrics to the song. He would write the part about Father McCartney writing the words of a sermon that no one would hear. And he would also suggest to Paul that this character should be darning his socks, which Paul liked. However, at this point, Pete Shotton stepped in and he suggested that the name should be changed from Father McCartney, because he said to Paul that fans, if they hear this, they might think you're writing about your dad, Jim McCartney. And Paul then thought, oh, I don't want people thinking that my dad's this lonely old vicar, because Paul's dad was actually quite a happy man at this point in his life. So, yeah, it was then changed from Father McCartney to Father Mackenzie, which Lennon didn't like. He felt it should have stayed as Father McCartney, which it does work, Father McCartney, writing the, etc. But I do think for Paul's sake and Paul's dad's sake, at the time, it was probably for the best that he changed it to Father Mackenzie. Now, McCartney couldn't decide how he wanted to end the song, so Pete Shotton would once again step in with an idea. He would suggest that these two lonely people should meet, but it would be too late. Father Mackenzie would be burying Eleanor. He would be conducting the funeral, which no one has attended. So these are two lonely people who could have been friends, could have been together, but they've met too late. John apparently hated this idea, but Paul liked it and he stuck with it. So yeah, that was virtually now more or less all the lyrics complete, bar a few tweaks that we needed, which were done in the studio. The Beatles' long-term road managers, Mal Evans and Neil Aspinall, they would contribute the final few words whilst in the studio. Now, Eleanor Rigby is one of two very interesting songs in the Lennon-McCartney songbook, because it's one of the few songs where John and Paul would not agree on who wrote it, the other big song being In My Life. Now, John claims that he wrote most of this song. All Paul wrote was the first verse, but other than that, John wrote everything else, and he would maintain this until he died. However, Paul disputes this. Paul says that John, he contributed a few words, but I think Paul said he would credit it 80% Paul, 20% John. And Pete Shotton would back up Paul on this. He would say that John's contribution to this song would be virtually nil, which is quite interesting, because reading what I've just said in the last bit, John's name didn't really come up contributing much. I mean, John claims that he wrote most of this song, but he doesn't actually say what it was he wrote, other than like what lyrics he contributed and stuff, if that makes sense. Whereas all the other people who were involved sort of back up with what they contribute. Basically, the evidence suggests that Paul is right on this, that this is a Paul song. And I'm sorry, I do agree here that this is a Paul McCartney song. And knowing Paul and the sort of lyrics he wrote, these lyrics are very McCartney compared to what Lennon lyrics were. But, you know, if we're going to talk about In My Life, that's a story for another day. But I would argue there that that's definitely a Lennon song, regardless of what Paul says. I think Lennon did most of that on his own. So, yeah, it was a point of contention between the two, this song, but I think I'm with Paul on who wrote it personally. So the Beatles would begin work on Eleanor Rigby at Abbey Road Studios, or EMI Studios as it was known then, on April 28th, 1966. Now, prior to this session taking place, Paul McCartney had recorded a solo piano demo of Eleanor Rigby and given it to George Martin so that George Martin could go away and create a score for the song. Now, Paul had told George Martin that he did not want the score for this song to be like Yesterday again. Basically, he thought, I've done that style of string quartet song, I want something different here. So with those instructions in mind, when writing the score for the song, Martin drew inspiration from Bernard Herrmann's soundtrack for the 1960 film Psycho, particularly the famous shower scene. Now, Eleanor Rigby will be the first Beatles song where none of the members of the band play any instruments on it. All the instrumentation on this song is done by session musicians. Therefore, Ringo doesn't appear on this song whatsoever, so his name won't come up again now, I don't think, in this video. Anyway, for this session, it was a pretty short one. Only John and Paul showed up, and they spent the entire session just sat in the control room in Studio 2, whilst George Martin was down on the studio floor conducting the orchestra. The session musicians this day consisted of 4 violin players called Tony Gilbert, Sidney Sachs, John Sharp and Jürgen Hess, 2 viola players called Stephen Shingles and John Underwood, and 2 cello players called Derek Simpson and Norman Jones. Now, the session musicians would have 2 very brief rehearsals of the song before then having a go at recording it properly. They would do 14 takes of the song, and it would be deemed that take 14 was the best and the one to start applying overdubs to. Now, if you want to hear any of these outtakes, you can. Take 2, I believe, has been released on the 2022 Super Deluxe edition of Revolver, but it's just an instrumental. It doesn't really sound all that different from the finished thing. It's not the best, most interesting outtake you'll ever hear, but if you want to hear virtually an instrumental version of Eleanor Rigby, you can over there on the deluxe edition. So the following day, April 29th, 1966, work would continue on Eleanor Rigby, and with the backing track having been successfully recorded the previous day by the session musicians, all that needed to be done now was the vocals. So to start with, Paul would record his lead vocal, and then Paul, John and George would overdub some harmony vocals onto the chorus. and they then mixed it and considered the song done, or at least they thought it was done. So on June 6th for 1966, the final session for Eleanor Rigby would take place. Now, up until this point, the band had considered the song finished. However, George Martin had had an idea, something that he thought could improve it, so he went to Paul with his idea. He asked McCartney to sing "Ah, Look at All the Lonely People" as a counterpoint during the final verse, which Paul agreed to, so would record it and then overdub it onto the track. And with that overdub done, they would then do a final mix of it, and that was it, it was ready to go. So Revolver was released on August 5th of 1966, and Eleanor Rigby was sequenced as the second track on the LP. Now, in breaking with a precedent, the Beatles would actually release Eleanor Rigby as a double A-side single along with Yellow Submarine on that same day, August 5th of 1966. Now, up until this point, the Beatles had been adamant no singles are being released from albums and no singles are going on albums. They considered it better value for money, that you're not buying the same thing twice, effectively. But they changed their minds here. They put out Eleanor Rigby and Yellow Submarine as a double A-side. Now, the reason why we believe it happened, I think George said at the time, was it was to stop people covering, because they thought a lot of people would cover Eleanor Rigby, and they'd be right. But they thought, we want to get out there with a single before other people cover it and make all the money off it. Because the following year, the previous year with Yesterday, the band had never put that out as a single, despite the fact it is the most covered song of all time. The Beatles never put it out as a single. They just buried it deep on the second side of Help. I think they were a little embarrassed by it to put it out as a single. So they didn't want them to make the same mistake here, so they put Eleanor Rigby out so that they got a head start with any singles that were bought, basically. They would make more money off the song than any cover versions would. So I think that's the reason why they put it out. Anyway, here in the UK, the first week it entered the charts at number 2, and then it would get up to number 1. It would peak at number 1, and it would stay there for 4 weeks. But over in the States, this single, it wouldn't reach number 1. It would only get as far as number 2, I think, is where it peaked. A lot of people believe the reason why this happened was because of the fallout of John's comments over there about the band being more popular than Jesus, so it put people off buying the records. But nevertheless, number 2 is still not a bad position to get. Right, let's not beat around the bush here. This song is a McCartney classic. There is a reason why it is one of the most covered Beatles songs that there is. I bloody love it. I think it's a masterpiece of a song, this. When I was writing the script for this video, believe it or not, I actually do script this stuff. But when I was writing this script, I was rereading the lyrics for Eleanor Rigby because it's a long time since I've actually sat down and read the lyrics. And it just blew my mind how good these lyrics are. I mean, stuff like wearing the face that you keeps in the jar by the door, who is it for, all the lonely people, where do they all come from? It's incredible that Paul McCartney, he was 23 years old when he wrote this song. I'll say that quite a lot about Paul's songs in this series, by the way, because it's a common trend with Paul's songs on this album. But a 23-year-old man here is writing about loneliness and people dying on their own, being left all on their own, no one at their funeral, that kind of thing. It's incredible that such a young man has such an open mind to stuff like this. Yeah, Paul McCartney, he is the William Shakespeare of our time. I'm telling you, 500 years' time, the way Shakespeare is looked at now, Paul McCartney will be looked at that way. He is an absolute genius. I love the man. And George Martin's strings as well, they perfectly capture the mood of this song. Yeah, you can tell the psycho influence on him, that shower scene, but just the striking element of them, along with Paul's quite dark, striking lyrics, it just perfectly complements each other. It's brilliant. The two of them work together amazingly. George Martin was the perfect producer for the Beatles, and especially Paul. He is the fifth Beatle, there is no doubt about that. Now, this song is so good that McCartney would more or less do a sequel to it a few years later in the form of Another Day. Now, I know he's never officially said that Another Day is supposed to be the sequel to Eleanor Rigby, but it does have the nickname Another Day of Eleanor Rigby Goes to New York. It's basically about lonely people in the big bad world of work, in office work and stuff, in the big cities. So yeah, it kind of is the sequel in some way. Now, when people first listened to Revolver or the Eleanor Rigby single, whichever way around you did it, it must have been pretty mind-blowing that this band, who had just not so long ago been singing songs like She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand, was now singing about loneliness and depression, effectively. I mean, this is topping the charts as well. This is a pretty dark song, let's not beat around the bush here. And, you know, at this point, the music industry, there wasn't really songs like this in the mainstream. They were all kind of like jangly guitar pop songs, not striking, orchestrated, depressive songs, really. But it just goes to show the Beatles' talent and Paul McCartney's talent, that he can cross all these different genres, these different styles of music, and appeal to all these different people. I mean, I imagine older people, lonely old people, there's a little McCartney pun, two lonely old people, etc. Sorry. I bet people like that, they'll love this song and be like, oh, they're writing the songs about me now. I was reading when I wrote this, I haven't put it in the script, but I'll mention it anyway, that the Beatles' early stuff, it was largely aimed at young female fans, and by Revolver, and particularly something like Eleanor Rigby, but Revolver as a whole, by this point the Beatles are trying to move away from these young female fans and instead get these deeper thinking male fans, is how it was phrased, which is maybe not the most politically, I know what it's trying to say, but it's maybe not the most politically correct thing to say, because what it's basically saying is girls like to scream at pop songs, whereas blokes like to be deep, meaningful things, and it's not true, to be fair. There is plenty of women who are deep thinking and love stuff like this. It's a fact, I'm sorry. But yeah, I don't know when that article where I read that was written. It was probably written many years ago. But yeah, basically what I'm trying to say here is this is the Beatles moving away. Regardless, it is moving away from that teeny boppy music that they did. Not that there's anything wrong with that. There's brilliant stuff in their early stuff. But this is a pretty big departure from songs like Love Me Do. And whilst, yes, the characters of Eleanor Rigby and Father Mackenzie are fictitious, it could be anybody. They could be real people. They could be me. They could be you. It could be any single person in the world. No one is immune from what this song is about, really. Any single person is at risk of what this song is about. Dying on your own, effectively, and no one coming to your funeral. Loneliness, man. Two lonely old people. Treat her gently. Treat her kind. Anyway, to conclude here, Eleanor Rigby, The Ballad of Loneliness. It's a brilliant song. It's an all-time classic. It is a masterpiece. And again, I'm going to say that about a lot of songs here on Revolver, because the album as a whole is a masterpiece. But yeah, Eleanor Rigby, the first of many fantastic McCartney songs to come on Revolver. So that concludes another episode of Revolver In Depth. Thank you very much for watching. If you have enjoyed this, please do like the video, leave a comment, subscribe if you're not already subscribed, all that jazz. If you've enjoyed this and you want to see the previous episodes in this series, well, good news, there is a playlist on my channel called Revolver In Depth, where you can find, at the moment, the one previous episode, plus all future episodes will also be added to that playlist. Anyway, join me next time here on Revolver In Depth, where I hope to God you won't spoil my day, because I'm miles away. Till then though, do take care.